Hi everyone, welcome back to Gentlemen for Cinephiles. So I am here today because I'm continuing our 2019 recap. Sorry about last week. I just got super overwhelmed with a very last minute thing that I can't announce yet that hopefully will lead to some very exciting things. So that switched my schedule around a bit. And then also I'm going into production for my next feature film. It is my big thesis project and it's actually technically going to be the first feature film I've ever released. So I'm taking extra care, great care with it. We had our first day of filming and my cinematographer Nicole actually came out, and so that was super exciting to get to see her again because I haven't seen her since she graduated like a month ago, not even, or a couple months ago. But yeah, she's one of my favorite creative collaborators ever. We also did the poster photos and everything like that on Sundays, so that was super exciting. But yes, now, I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in to The Irishman. But really quick, before I dive into The Irishman, I'm just going to update you guys on next week. So next week, we are kicking off Oscar week. So we are going to be doing an episode a day. Now, I particularly only talk about the specific categories that I feel like I'm relatively qualified to talk about. So that's like, Best Picture, Best Director. I don't really talk about screenplay or animated movie just because I don't watch them as much. And also, I don't feel like my overt expertise is screenplay, and I have a hard time judging screenplays because also I feel everyone's opinion is valid in terms of screenplay writing, and so I know the act of writing is screenplay, but I'm not necessarily the best judge of screenplay because I'm just kind of like, well, it's their story and I feel it's valid. So I kind of focus it on the categories that I feel comfortable talking about, like performance, best picture, best director, all that stuff, editing. So yeah, next week we'll be doing every single day, and then, we'll have our Saturday show and all that stuff. So that'll be super, super exciting. Yes. So yeah, anyway, to continue into today's topic. So today we are doing a little bit more of an in-depth look at Martin Scorsese's latest film, The Irishman. I am obsessed. It is one of my favorite Scorsese films. My favorite Scorsese films are as follows. I really love, really quick, so to talk about Scorsese, I feel like he's one of the directors I'm most versed in because I've seen a majority of his work. I think I've seen well over 90% of his work. And also, I just feel really close to him as a filmmaker. He's one of my biggest influences for sure. So yeah, my favorite Scorsese films are in no particular order. My top three. The Last Temptation of Christ, Age of Innocence, and Casino. Those are my three favorite Scorsese films. I know it's almost sacrilegious to not say Goodfellas or Taxi Driver or something. I do love all of those too. I love pretty much all of his work. Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, all of those kind of films. Excellent. I think he excels as a director. The only two that get me are Silence and Shutter Island, but that's a conversation for another day. The Irishman, I would say, is a solid top 4 pick for me. I loved it. It really reminded me, so my favorite Scorsese gangster film is Casino. I just love the length. I think it's the perfect story, and I really like the epic formness of Casino. And I think that's something that Scorsese really revisits in The Irishman, and it's something I really, really appreciate. So yeah, I'm gonna kind of go through some big topics here. So the film is about kind of this man, Frank Sheehan, and him getting involved with gangsters, then, getting involved with Jimmy Hoffa and the labor unions, and then furthermore, when Hoffa comes back from prison, it kind of deals with him and Hoffa's relationship, how Hoffa is trying to seize his union back, how people don't really like him that much, and then his disappearance. However, in this movie, it is, it goes into how he might have been killed by the mafia. So that's kind of what the film is about. It's based off this book called I Hear You Paint Houses. So that's one of the theories as to what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. Nothing has been officially confirmed 100%, so the film kind of exists in this really interesting place. It actually is, it's really interesting because that's the approach to the narrative is really interesting and fascinating to me because it's something I really like to do with true crime, missing persons cases that I particularly like, in particular the Black Dahlia, Joan Riche, because my recent capstone, it's it takes the story of Joan Riche, the missing person, and it kind of extrapolates that story and creates its own narrative based off of that. And I feel like The Irishman, in a lot of ways, does that same thing very, very excellently. So it was really great for me because I got to see a really great example of that I could homage, or that I could even like kind of look and see how that format kind of works. And that's something I really, really appreciated about it as well, was how it took this kind of foundational real life event and expanded off of that. It was a very non-traditional, based off a true story kind of movie, and that was also really, really interesting to me. So yeah, I have a couple different topic areas that we're going to kind of discuss. And so first things first, we're going to discuss the whole Netflix drama that happened, because I think The Irishman is really reflective of this new age of streaming and movies, and it holds a really interesting place for it. So Scorsese was a part of something called the film school generation. And the film school generation, in film history terms, cinematic history, particularly American cinematic history terms, it is a era in which a bunch of the big filmmakers started coming out of film school, as opposed to, you know, making movies for studios and things like that, and kind of being bred to make movies. They went to film school, they studied the art of making film, and then they started becoming filmmakers. And Scorsese was a huge, you know, person in that. Some other ones are like George Lucas, Brian De Palma, Steven Spielberg. They all come from that generation, right? And so it's interesting because I feel like we're in this new age of independent media and also independent film production, where it's getting extended even further. So with the film school generation, it was a break away from the old studio system, the old Hollywood studio system, and it introduced this idea of independent cinema to kind of the film history conversation. And now when you look at things like Netflix, things like streaming, things like Hulu, and even further than that, like YouTube and social media, you get this really, really interesting sense that there's a new independent age coming about, because there's an increase in accessibility that really reflects and mirrors the film school generation of the past, which is really, really fascinating, and a really, really it's a thing we're in the midst of as well, and nobody, I think, really knows how to handle it or what to do very much, you know? And that, I think, is very, very apparent when you look at this Netflix drama that The Irishman faced. And I won't even say that it was Irishman that created the drama. It was a hard statement by Scorsese just in the act of it. So the interesting thing about The Irishman is Martin Scorsese, he is seen as one of the peak excellent auteurs of cinema, right? He's a very valid creator. He's very accepted in the film community, in the film space. And he made the decision to make a film that was a Netflix original film, right? So that in a lot of ways gave a lot of validity to this kind of new age of independent media, and kind of gave a lot of validity to streaming platforms and, you know, streaming platforms' approach to cinematic production, as opposed to the traditional theatrical release, festival run, etc., etc. I'm not saying The Irishman didn't also do those things, because it did have a limited theatrical release, and I believe it did also premiere at a festival, but having it be a Netflix original was really, really interesting. And it was a really hard statement, because there was a lot of drama with a lot of people in the film school generation. I think it was particularly Steven Spielberg, in which Steven Spielberg and the Academy were considering not counting Netflix movies for being able to. So Roma last year was a really big movie, and that was also a Netflix movie. And there was a whole kerfuffle last year in which Steven Spielberg and a lot of members of the Academy felt that they weren't sure if Netflix films were valid enough to be considered for things like Oscar-nominated movies, because there was a sense in this idea that, oh, well, a Netflix movie is a TV movie. It's not a real movie, whatever real movie means. But I think it was interesting because around that same time, it came out that Scorsese's film, The Irishman, was going to be a Netflix original movie, or not a Netflix original movie, released on Netflix and exclusively Netflix. So that was really, really fascinating. And I think it's interesting that out of all the people in the film school generation, Scorsese's kind of the one who's really ahead of the curve and seeing independent media as something that's a little bit more valid than what a lot of people have been saying or have been acting like. So that was a huge, really interesting thing. And so I think The Irishman is interesting in that it's not a TV movie at all. It's not a TV movie in the slightest. And Scorsese lending his voice to Netflix and in favor of Netflix and streaming sites like Hulu, Netflix, X, Y, and Z was really, really fascinating, and it really kind of shook up the conversation a lot. And I know that, obviously Netflix films were not barred from, the Academy. The Irishman is up for Best Picture and a lot of other nominations and awards. But yeah, so that was initially the first thing I wanted to talk about with the Irishman, because I think it represents a bigger conversation happening in media, in film today. So that was super interesting. It has 10 Oscar nominations, actually, so we're going to be talking about it quite a bit during Oscar week next week. I won't go into those because we're going to be talking about those next week, but yeah. So Jimmy Hoffa, I Paint Houses. So the really interesting thing about this, too, is that it is not just... Ooh, excuse me. The really interesting thing about The Irishman, too, that I think that I loved so much about it, I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was talking about Casino and how I saw, a lot of parallels compared to something like Goodfellas, was that, well, even Goodfellas has a lot of the comparisons, actually. I take that back. But I really liked how it was not just a gangster film. It was a gangster epic. And that was the thing, I think, that edged out The Irishman and took it from a good movie to a great movie. Because the way it follows Joseph Campbell's, hero's journey, which is, it's this, I think he's an anthropologist or something like that. And he, looked at a lot of stories across a lot of different areas, like Greek mythology, folk tales, X, Y, and Z from a lot of different cultures. And he found a consistency in all of those stories in which could be boiled down to the hero's journey. So, you have the initial inciting incident, and then you have, the hero going through a bunch of trials, and you have, archetypes of certain characters the hero interacts with. And The Irishman really, really closely follows the hero's journey. And so that made it really interesting and accessible in an interesting way, too, because, gangster film isn't something as, we don't see gangster film in the traditional sense a lot anymore. We're seeing a resurgence in gangster film in the last year, but I think Scorsese taking it in an epic gangster film direction really extends off of things he was doing in Goodfellas but didn't fully do in Goodfellas, and things that he did in Casino that wasn't received necessarily as well as, something like Goodfellas, which didn't fully extend, the hero's journey points and the hero's journey narrative and storyline. And when he takes it and runs with it in The Irishman, it's really, really fascinating, and I think it also really updates the genre. The next episode this week is going to be about Hustlers, which I think is another film that really updates the gangster film genre. So I think it's interesting that the gangster film genre has been kind of dormant-esque for a couple of years, and we get this year in which I feel like there was a lot of updates to the genre, which was really, really amazing, because gangster film is one of my favorite film genres. I think cinema in a lot of ways started with gangsters. Great Train Robbery is about gangsters, essentially. And so that was really, really, really interesting. And then also, applying the hero's journey to gangster film too, I think in this general cultural consensus, we have this idea that the hero's journey can only apply to these absolute good type of characters. So for example, when you look at the hero's journey, you can think a lot of Disney movies follow the hero's journey, and there's this absolute good sense to the hero's journey in which the hero is the morally superior person and he's going along his story and X, Y, and Z. However, placing it in the context of a gangster film and, allowing more amoral characters doing more morally permissible as opposed to morally good actions was really, really fascinating, because it allowed an audience, I think, to put their guard down and connect to characters in a different type of way. And also it made the characters a lot more dynamic than a traditional hero's journey. There wasn't the sense that to be a hero, you have to be an absolute good figure. And that was really interesting too. And also I think, looking at Scorsese, he has a very strong Catholic through line in all of his movies. It's because I think he's a practicing Catholic. I think he's either practicing or he was practicing. I don't know. But he's very close to Catholicism in his movies, and he has a lot of respect for Catholicism. And it was interesting to see that also play into the hero's journey. One of my favorite parts of the movie that I think was the movie taking a risk was the last half hour of the movie, essentially, is just this character of Robert De Niro's character, I think it's Frank, going through the process of preparing for death. And that was really, really fascinating and interesting to me. The way a lot of modern movies play around with death is in a very, vapid kind of way. Death isn't necessarily seen as... I don't think people really explore the permanence of it that much, or the kind of idea of preparation of it that much. I think it's treated as this kind of thing that we all know happens, but not something we all quite deal with. And I know a lot of cinema does deal with that, but I'm saying like, you know, recent trend movies, things like that. And looking at The Irishman taking such care with showcasing the whole end of somebody's life and like the guilt that person is facing and how that plays into the end of their life and like how a person is truly alone, that was also really, really well done. And I think really, really well acted, and something that also elevated the film. And that was something that made a lot more sense because the film followed a hero's journey approach. We don't necessarily follow the character Robert De Niro from like birth to death, but when we pick up with him, there is this great arc he has in his character that was really, really something an audience could relate to despite the cinematic circumstances of the narrative. So yeah, that was really, really fascinating. That's something I really, really loved. And then kind of, you know, so those were the big things I really loved about it. And like, I also really, the performances, excellent. Al Pacino as Jimmy Hoffa was amazing. He was one of my favorite performances of the year and maybe even all time, honestly. It was just so good to see Al Pacino in, it was so good to see Al Pacino in a Scorsese gangster movie because he's so good. And, you know, having everybody come back together, like I was the most annoying person in the theater, right? Because I got lucky because I had a free birthday ticket to Alamo Drafthouse around the time Irishman released, and so I got to go see it, and I went to like a 10:30 showing, and I had like a glass of 19 Crimes, and it hit me way harder than it usually does. And I remember like everyone was showing up at the beginning, and every single like Scorsese like cinematic universe character that showed up, I was like like really loud in the theater, and it was so embarrassing when I couldn't help myself. So like I remember the biggest one was Harvey Keitel. I was like, oh my god, there he is. Everyone's back together, and it was really lame and stupid, and I just had to tell you guys that because I felt really embarrassed about it and I need to be revalidated. But yeah, another thing that was interesting, because there was a lot of controversies at the sorry, I did not segue very well there. So there was a lot of controversy this year about female performances in particular, and that was really fascinating to me because like I am the biggest, you know, woman in film, women need more representation in film person, but I felt like it was interesting the things that women, or the things that were focused on by, you know, the people who talked about the controversies. I covered the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood scandal. I covered that a couple months ago on the podcast and kind of talked about how it was really frustrating when people were focusing very strongly on, oh, Sharon Tate didn't have a lot of lines, and that was really frustrating, and that kind of shows this disrespect towards women. And it was really frustrating to me because there were so many other women in the narrative that were very strong women that were not like the butt of jokes, that were not meant to be anything but strong, intellectual, intelligent women that are empowering to watch. And I don't know why the conversation focused so hard on Sharon Tate in particular. So that was interesting, and I covered that like way before, so you can check that out on the Women of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood episode, and we may even talk about it a little bit during Oscar week. But then Scorsese, this film in particular, got a lot of controversy, The Irishman, because I have her name here, but I completely think I'm gonna like flub it, and I'm so sorry. Anna Paquin. So I'm going to say Anna Paquin. I'm going to call her Anna. So there was a really big controversy around Anna's character in particular. So she plays Robert De Niro's daughter in the film. And she's kind of like watching her dad as he goes along. And she's a very silent character throughout the narrative. And people were really frustrated about that. People were really upset that it was kind of like, they were saying it was kind of like a boys club movie in which, you know, the women didn't get any lines. Once again, I just like to point out, you know, I'm the number one person to talk about, you know, women in representation, you know what I mean? Like, talking about how Greta Gerwig didn't get nominated for an Oscar, things like that, how we need more roles for women of color, how we need more roles for women in general, but I get so frustrated at what people focus on. So looking at The Irishman, there are a couple reasons why. Not that I think the controversy is fine. Like, I completely understand if somebody's upset about it, but I just kind of want to talk about it from my perspective as somebody who's like, I would say like a scholar of Scorsese. I'm very familiar with his other work, and I think I have an understanding of what he was trying to do by making Anna Paquin's character so silent. I'd just like to explain that a little bit, and I'd also just like to point out, like, too, well, first we'll just talk about Anna Paquin's character, and then we'll talk about the other women in the film. So, yeah, it was interesting to me because, so Scorsese, in all of his movies, particularly his gangster films, deals very strongly in the child's gaze, right? And that's the child's gaze on the world around them and the child's gaze on, authority in particular. And I think a lot of that comes from Scorsese's upbringing in New York. Upbringing. I don't know what that accent came from. I think a lot of it comes from Scorsese's upbringing in New York, where he saw the very interesting relationship between gangsters and the law enforcement and the Catholic Church. That kind of like trio of people, Scorsese in particular as a kid watched that, and that was very, very it was something that really strongly affected him, right? And I think that drives into and plays into a lot of the narratives that he is discussing, and a lot of the narratives, the gangster film narratives in particular. So when you have Goodfellas, you have this kid that kind of feels like a representation of Scorsese in his youth, watching these gangster figures and wanting to take on that image. And so it's Scorsese exploring if he had taken on that image in Goodfellas. Because Henry in Goodfellas, the titular character, he starts off as a kid watching these like wise guys, gangster figures, go about their days and do that stuff. And then he slowly becomes more immersed in that world. Whereas when you look at something like Casino, moving on to a different Scorsese gangster film, you have Robert De Niro and, Sharon Tate, not Sharon Tate. You have Robert De Niro and, oh my God, Sharon Stone. Then when you move on to Casino, a later Scorsese gangster film, you have Robert De Niro and Sharon Stone's daughter, and it's very expressed that the daughter is watching her parents. There's a lot of cutaways, particularly in the editing, in which the daughter is watching the two parents interact. Now, we don't necessarily get a full follow-through for that, and I think that's part of, like, The Irishman is kind of just the next step in how Scorsese's been showing children his whole career. But, so essentially, his whole career, he's been very mindful of a child's look at the people around them and the world around them and how that conditions a child as they grow up. And that's a really, really fascinating through line that not a lot of people talk about in Scorsese movies because it's kind of, overshadowed by the violence and all of those things. But yeah, this whole kind of, corruption of the innocent and corruption of youth through being forced to watch all these adults who aren't moral, who aren't good overall, good in the societal sense of good. And so when you look at The Irishman, Anna Paquin's character really, really serves this function of she's watching her father and she knows what's happening. And she becomes wise to it over time. And, you see the effects of it in a lot stronger than you see it in Goodfellas and in Casino. Now, in Goodfellas, it's about the child character growing up into a gangster. So that's why I don't think you necessarily see it in the same way. It's a child seeing gangsters and becoming like them because he wants to and he's fascinated by that world. And then Casino, you have the daughter watching, but you don't necessarily get a follow through with what that does to her. But then in The Irishman, you get this child watching her father slowly getting older and still watching her father and not wanting a relationship with him because of what she is seeing and what she's perceiving because, she's an observant child who has, because she's observant and because she becomes wise to his act and she knows. And so that leads her to cut off contact with her father. And so I think the silence of the character is something that's a really it's a strength for the character, I think, in a lot of ways. And I don't think the strength of female characters comes from like very specific parameters. And I think the way Anna Paquin plays it, and I think also the way she talks about the role, and because I know she came out with a statement saying she has the utmost respect for the role, she's the utmost respect for the film, and she's like happy to be a part of it and all that stuff. I think it was a very mindful decision to make her a quiet, observable character. It wasn't, I don't think women have a valid perspective, so I'm going to silence them decision. So that's just from my perspective, kind of seeing Scorsese's work. And also, I'd just like to point to the other women in the film, like particularly Joe Pesci's wife, who there's a very established scene with the two of them where she's the one in charge. She's showing him how to be a mafia person, how to act after a hit, and she's participating in a very strong and authoritative way. And so I really like some more emphasis too on the other women that exist within the narrative, because I think women are shown as to be very strong. I know, like, not a lot of women are, I'm not saying women have to be empowered by gangster women and Scorsese women. I just, look at the other women in the narrative too, It's really important. So that was my bit on the controversy of, the women speaking in the film and not having enough lines and things like that. But yeah, so I really loved The Irishman. I thought it was an excellent movie. I can't wait to see Scorsese's next movie. It broke my heart a little bit because it's not actually about H.H. Holmes, which I really hoped it would be, but that's okay. But thank you guys so much for watching. Next week we are going to be talking about a female-led, amazing gangster movie that is probably one of my favorites that came out of last year. It's at the top of my top films that describe me list. And that is Hustlers. So you can look forward to that on Thursday. And thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful day. Bye. Mwah.